It seems that the announcement by Liverpool that it planned to submerge the valley and construct a reservoir was initially greeted with silence in Cwm Tryweryn, to give the valley its Welsh name, as the shocked inhabitants who lived and worked there came to terms with the news of Liverpool's proposal. It would, the community realised, not only result in the destruction of the small village of Capel Celyn, which is home to some 20 people and comprised 6 homes, along with a chapel, the burial ground, the post office and the village school, but it would also involve the removal of 12 farms and the partial removal of 20 others, where a further 55 or so people lived. So some 75 people to be affected in total. 3 months later, during the evening of the 23rd of March 1956, the inhabitants of the valley met and formed the Capel Celyn Defence Committee. It intended to prevent Liverpool from building its planned reservoir. One of the people who came to prominence at this time was a school teacher named Elizabeth Watkin Jones. Now, Elizabeth, who worked in a school in Bala, some 7 miles from the Tryweryn Valley, was born and raised in the village of Capel Celyn. She loved the village and the valley, and Elizabeth was angered at the thought that Liverpool wanted to flood it and construct a reservoir. Although Elizabeth was rather a shy and reserved lady, and also familiar with politics and how the political machine works, she set about her task of notifying prominent community figures across Wales and beyond with great intent and purpose. Over the coming weeks and months, Elizabeth wrote hundreds of letters to political leaders, trade unions, churches, chapels, and social societies, all with the intention of galvanising and rousing support for the Capel Celyn Defence Committee, and it worked. The proposed flooding of the Tryweryn Valley by Liverpool was greeted with anger across Wales. Importantly, this opposition to Liverpool's plans was expressed across political, generational, and denominational lines. So what does this mean? Well, irrespective of what political party a person belonged to in Wales, the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal, or the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, and regardless of whether you were a young person or an older person, or whether you attended a church or a chapel or any other place of religious worship, or if you did not uphold a religious faith. It seems that nearly everyone in Wales was opposed to Liverpool's plan to flood the Tryweryn Valley and to build a reservoir there. So we've established that in December 1955, Liverpool announced its intention to flood the Tryweryn Valley and construct a reservoir, and that the news of Liverpool's plan has been greeted with anger and opposition in Wales. So let's just put that to one side for a moment and consider why Liverpool believed it needed to build a reservoir in Cwm Tryweryn. In 1945, as many of you will know, the Second World War ended. Many millions of people had been killed, and although Great Britain had played a decisive role in the Allied victory that defeated Nazi Germany and other countries controlled by fascist governments, the United Kingdom emerged from the war battered, bruised, and bankrupt. Along with the financial cost, the war had also taken a terrible emotional toll on the people of Britain. Many UK citizens were left traumatised, not only through having experienced bombing raids, but also because of the death of a loved one, a father, a brother, a sister, a mother, killed either in combat, through German air attacks, or the wider struggle. Many of Britain's cities had been heavily bombed by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Among them are Cardiff, Swansea, and Newport. But one city that was severely targeted during the German bombing campaign was Liverpool. One reason for this is that Liverpool is a city with a port, and many of the things that Britain needed to help win the war, such as guns, food, and fuel, arrived in Liverpool on ships from the United States, which, of course, was Britain's foremost ally during the war. Now, close to the docks in Liverpool was the city's notorious slum housing. Along with Glasgow, Liverpool had the worst slum housing in Great Britain. While I researched the information that I needed to write a book about the flooding of the Tryweryn Valley by Liverpool, to gain a better understanding of what life was like living in the Liverpool slums, I spoke with Liverpool historian called Steve Binns, who was undertaking his research into the slums of Liverpool and what the day-to-day existence was like for those who lived there. And I have to say, I came away from my discussion with Steve believing that living in the slums must have been awful. Many people lived together in cramped, overcrowded rooms which were cold. The houses had no heating, no radiators, which as most of us enjoy today. The houses were damp and full of fleas that lived in the crumbling walls. It was, so Steve told me, a drab, smelly, awkward struggle of a life, just dreadful. And with the war finally at an end in August 1945, the authorities in Liverpool decided to knock down the slum houses and embark on a housing redevelopment programme, which simply meant that the slums would be cleared and people relocated to live in new houses away from Liverpool city centre. So I mentioned Elizabeth Watkin-Jones earlier, the lady from the village of Capel Celyn who wrote hundreds of letters hoping to attract opposition from across Wales to Liverpool's proposal to flood the Tryweryn Valley. Well, Liverpool had its own rather fearsome and committed character too. Her name was Bessie Braddock. Bessie was a Liverpool Member of Parliament and she was married to John, or Jack, Braddock. Both Bessie and her husband Jack were proud members of the Labour Party and were passionate about helping the people who live in the slum areas of Liverpool to move to better homes, where it was felt these people would not only have nicer homes to live in, but so too would they have improved opportunities to advance and further their lives. A perfectly reasonable idea, you might think. To meet the huge cost of knocking down the slums in Liverpool and building new homes, Liverpool knew that it would need a lot of money. And one way of receiving money was to sell water to neighbouring authorities in and around Liverpool and Merseyside, such as towns like Warrington and St Helens and many more besides. But so too could Liverpool sell water to industry, and by doing so, it would attract work and employment to Liverpool and Merseyside, as many firms and businesses would then move to the area and establish factories and so on. In addition to these factors, Liverpool also believed that more people used water in their daily lives by the 1950s. For instance, through showering or having baths more often, by each home having a toilet or perhaps even more than one toilet, and through most homes having a washing machine rather than using a nearby laundrette to wash their clothes. Having weighed up all these aspects, Liverpool decided that what the city needed was another reservoir to receive the water required to sell and use in the city's homes and factories. To the authorities in Liverpool, including Bessie and Jack Braddock, the answer was simple. What Liverpool must do is build a reservoir in a valley some relatively short distance away from the city and pipe the water to Liverpool. This would be achieved, the Liverpool City Council confidently predicted, by receiving the support of Parliament, which would vote in favour of an act which would provide Liverpool the legal authority it required to remove a community that might live in a valley and to construct a reservoir there. Now, and importantly, Liverpool had done this some 70 years earlier. In the 1880s, the Liverpool City Council received the support of Parliament and removed a Welsh-speaking community from their homes, farms and businesses in mid-Wales and built another reservoir called Llynfernwy, or Lake Fynwy. And it must be said that opposition to Liverpool's construction of Llynfernwy was small and largely insignificant. Although anger was raised at a local level, the construction of the reservoir did not attract the degree of rage and opposition that the construction of the reservoir in Cwm Tryweryn was to receive some 70 years later during the 1960s. And let's remember that, because we shall come back to this point in a little while. So Liverpool has decided that it needs to build another reservoir, and having looked at the options, it has decided that the reservoir it needs to build, which will provide Liverpool with what it claims it requires, 65 million gallons of water every day, is in the Tryweryn Valley in North Wales. So what's happening in Wales at this time? Well, the opposition to Liverpool's plan has increased even more. All the many letters that Elizabeth has written and posted appealing for support in the fight to stop Liverpool from building its proposed reservoir in Cwm Tryweryn have had the desired effect. The whole of Wales is said to be united in its opposition to Liverpool's plan. But while Elizabeth and other leading members of the opposition group are pleased with this support, they also believe that what they need to do is to go to Liverpool and speak to members of Liverpool's City Council who represent areas throughout Liverpool. Why do Elizabeth and those opposed to the reservoir plan feel that this is so important? It's because they are convinced that Liverpool City Councillors are not being provided the true picture as presented to them by the Labour Party of Liverpool, which controls Liverpool City Council. And why is Labour in control of the council? because more Labour members have been elected to the council, people such as Bessie and Jack Braddock. While Labour is in control of Liverpool City Council, there are many Liverpool councillors who are not members of the Labour Party, and it is these people in particular that Elizabeth and other leading figures in opposition group in Wales believe they need to speak to. So, Elizabeth writes to Liverpool City Council asking that members of the Capel Celyn Defence Committee be allowed to address Liverpool City councillors to state their case as to why it is opposed to Liverpool's plan. Elizabeth sends 3 letters requesting this over a few months, and in response to each letter received, Liverpool City Council replies stating, "No, we will not allow you to speak to Liverpool councillors in the council chamber, but we will allow you to speak to the Liverpool Water Committee, which was a subsection, a department within Liverpool City Council." Elizabeth and opposition figures in Wales considered this to be an insult and a deliberate way of preventing the Capel Celyn Defence Committee from addressing the people that might make a difference, members of Liverpool City Council. And so, on the 21st of November 1956, nearly a year after members of the Cwm Tryweryn community first learned that Liverpool wanted to knock down their homes and build a reservoir in the valley where they live, all but 4 of the Cwm Tryweryn community marched through Liverpool with banners appealing that Liverpool drop its plan to build its reservoir. The community also hopes that the march will attract the support of the people of Liverpool who are going about their daily business in the city centre, and also that the march will receive sympathetic coverage in the Liverpool newspapers. But it doesn't happen. Although some degree of support is received, the march doesn't prove to be the game changer that opposition figures are hoping for. And Liverpool City Council votes in favour of submitting the bill, known as Liverpool Corporation's Tryweryn Reservoir Bill, to Parliament, where it is hoped in the coming months members of Parliament from across Great Britain will vote in support of it. So let's just pause there for a moment and consider the images which support this talk. So I have on my screen, so I just go back. So there we are, Cwm Tryweryn, obviously prior to the flooding. This is in the early 1950s. The reservoir, the dam wall, you might say, is at the far end of the valley. We're looking down towards Bala there. Capel Celyn is here to the left of the image. Sun housing in Liverpool. I chose 3 images. There were many that were in the archive, and I wanted to capture what life was lived in there. You see the sort of the overcrowding and how difficult that must have been. We then take a picture of the sanitary situation. And a typical home. So again, well, it's far from ideal, isn't it? It's an awful image. You can see why Liverpool City councillors. I mentioned the Labour Party being in control of Liverpool. It should be stated that support for the slum clearance policy was expressed across sort of political colours in Liverpool. There was some resistance, which I'll come to, but it was a policy supported by Conservative members as well, and Liberal members and some independent members of the council. So there we are, Capel Celyn, coming in on the road from Trawsfynydd on the way to Bala. Another shot of the village. You see the post office there to what is my left. Ysgol Capel Celyn in the middle. The chapel and the burial ground, which we'll come to, they feature strongly and rather prominently in the story, the cause of much of the anger. That is a shot of the Capel Celyn post office and general stores. That is Harriet Jones Parry there collecting the daily bread. Harriet had a long-standing connection with the valley. Her father ran the post office before she did. She was married to John Parry, and they had a daughter called Betha. And the Capel Celyn post office really is the hub of the community. Here we have a cross section of the property. I mean, part of the propaganda, if you will, coming out of Liverpool at this time, during the judicial process, is the fact that what Liverpool is selling is the idea that these homes are dilapidated, worthy of nothing more than being knocked down, and that the land is marshy and agricultural. From an agricultural point of view, it's of poor quality. Now, again, this is questioned, as we shall see in further images. But that is one of the properties, not great, but it's also been suggested that as more money came into the British economy in the sort of 60s and 70s, this would have been a typical post-war dwelling, but it would have been redeveloped as, of course, other farming dwellings across Wales were redeveloped as more money entered the economy and agricultural improvements and so on. Now that farm is called Caevadog, and the family there called Rowlands, David Rowlands, who's the chairman of the Capel Celyn Defence Committee, from what I gather, looking at the archival record, a good farm, good agricultural value. So again, it counters the argument coming out of Liverpool. David Roberts' family had farmed at Caevadog for 300 years, 6 generations. So there's a deep emotional attachment to the farm. As we will also discover, people like David Rowlands didn't last very long. I have to put it rather bluntly. He left his property in 1961, 62, and the poor gentleman passed away in 1965, just prior to the opening of Cwm Celyn, as did Elizabeth Watkin Jones. So there is a suggestion that it had a deep traumatic impact on those from the area, one of whom very sadly was David Rowlands. And none of these people were particularly elderly. Sort of Mrs. Elizabeth Watkin Jones, for instance, was only sort of late 50s. David Roberts was in his mid 70s. Penfawr, now that's considered to be one of the best farms in the area. Now that is in the valley floor. So again, we're looking at this from the agricultural point of view of it being marshy, which is the propaganda coming out of Liverpool. One of the best farms in the area, without a doubt. So without improvements in agriculture, it's been suggested that the area would have been drained anyway. And it should also be noted that crops like wheat and barley are being grown not that far from the valley floor. So yes, while the valley floor was prone to flooding and was marshy, with the improvements of agriculture later on, it's been suggested that it would have been drained and it would have benefited from those agricultural improvements. But certainly one of the best farms in the area, and again, sharply contradicts the propaganda coming out of Liverpool and the Liverpool media at this time. Dolfawr, again, a typical farm. And again, one of the properties which isn't so great. That's called the Gelli. Bryn Hyfryd 1 and 2. Now that house, well, 2 houses are on the road out of Capel Celyn on the way to Bala. Again, it's been suggested that it should have been knocked down. Other people said, well, you know, it's on a prime road. What today is only 7 miles from Bala. The village would have developed like other villages similar, that looked much the same way as properties like that did in the post-war period, would have been developed and would have been prime sort of commuter sort of country. Even people traveling to Liverpool isn't unheard of from that area today, and Manchester, for instance, to work. Bessie and Jack Braddock. Now, one of the joys of research, as I say during my presentations, is seeing characters emerge. And I have to say, I developed rather a strong affection for Mrs. Braddock. She's a raucous character, no quarter asked or given, fought tooth and nail for the people, the underprivileged of Liverpool. One reason for that was that she had seen hunger on a level in Liverpool which was unprecedented, really, in the great hunger of 1905, 1906, where people were literally at soup kitchens with their lips blue with hunger. So it had a deep emotional impact on Mrs. Braddock. And so her sort of loyalty is to socialism and the Labour Party, and giving people better homes to live in and providing them with opportunities such as employment to improve their lives, as was her husband Jack, of course. Elizabeth Watkin Jones, another remarkable lady, again in opposition to the plans of people like Mrs. Braddock, but equally as impressive. She gave up so much of her time in terms of writing letters. Her father, from what I gather, paid for the postage and wrote the addresses on the envelopes, and his daughter there wrote the letters. So very impressive. This is the 17th of December 1956, and a meeting at St. George's Hall in Liverpool. We see Jack Braddock there to what is my left, somewhat looking at the camera. And they needed a show of hands. Liverpool realised what they needed was a civic vote. So they asked the ratepayers of Liverpool to attend this meeting. Now, those in opposition have said this was deliberately timed to undermine opposition, because it was time for a 2:30 on a Monday afternoon, when it was realised that most people would be in work. And having gauged how many were there in opposition, 160, Jack Braddock and others on the platform there went around the council offices, which were part of Liverpool St. George's Hall, and from what I gather, said, you and you downstairs, vote in support of this bill. Having gauged how many were in opposition, they then assured that there were 100 in support, and it was passed through by 262 votes to 161. Accusations of skullduggery, if you like, from those in opposition, who said that not only was this deliberately timed for 2:30 on a Monday afternoon, protocol dictated it should start at exactly 2:30, when in fact it didn't start until 10 to 3, which had given the people on the platform, Jack Braddock and Frank Kane, who later becomes the Lord Mayor of Liverpool, enough time to get the show of hands in their favour. So I think this is relatively early on, of course, in the acquisition process, but it set the scene really for Liverpool, which made it quite clear how determined Liverpool were to see this bill succeed. This is a draft of a letter, one of the three which Elizabeth Watkin Jones wrote in July. We see there July 2nd, 1956. A draft copy, as I say. It's as she states here, my committee feels strongly that so useful purpose would be served by meeting your councils, that no useful purpose would be served rather. And she's asking to meet members of Liverpool City Council, which of course is always going to be denied by people like Jack Braddock. He doesn't entertain that idea at all. So he tries to palm them off, if you like, with meeting members of the Liverpool Water Committee. And so here we are, 21st of November, nearly a year after they read, the local community there read in their editions of the Liverpool Daily Post. They go to Liverpool. It's led by Plaid Cymru. Gwynfor Evans, from what I understand, approach the community and say, look, this now needs to be given leadership, national leadership. Elizabeth Watkin Jones, of course, has done brilliantly, but it now needs to be handed over to Plaid Cymru, who give it more of a national platform. Some I've spoken to said that was harsh, unduly unfair, because it sidelined her really to some effect. But nonetheless, others I spoke to said, well, that's exactly what this protest needed at this time. So they go to Liverpool, all but for the community, 2 babies. So I don't think we can blame them for not going, but the other 2, I'll explain why in a moment. Here we are. I've spoken with a number of people who attended the march. Some told me that they were greeted with a certain degree of hostility. 1 or 2 said it was open anger, with rotten tomatoes and bad language and all the rest of it. Others I spoke to said that they couldn't recount that, and their recollection was one basically of ambivalence and indifference from the people of Liverpool going about their daily business. It seems that most people didn't realise who they were and what they were doing there. The gentleman, the young lad with the school cap in front of me here, Elwyn Edwards. I spoke to Mr. Edwards in Thread in a New Dawn. He features in the book, and basically said that he was given something of a cane as we say in this part of the world, punished with a stick across the backside, and for wasting his time on a dreary place like Capel Celyn. This was by the headmaster, who saw that photograph in a Liverpool Daily Post the following day. However, history being what it is and research being what it is, I've since been told that he was mildly chastised, really. So again, is this the fog of history, or is this people embellishing a story for their own political ends? It's open to interpretation, I think. And that is Henry Brooke, but I'll just go back to the previous slide and come on to Mr. Brooke in a moment. And so, now, significantly, I think, during this period, opposition figures in Wales suggest alternative plans and other valleys which they consider a more suitable location that Liverpool can flood. If Liverpool has a genuine need to increase its water supply, they reason, then Wales will support Liverpool to achieve that. To this end, it is suggested that Liverpool increase the height of the dam at Lake Vyrnwy and, by doing so, increase the amount of water that the reservoir holds. Alternatively, what about this valley or that valley, which is close by but is not inhabited, and therefore it is not home to a Welsh-speaking community? Yet, despite these suggestions being put forward, they are each rejected by Liverpool. But why is Liverpool so determined to construct this reservoir at Cwm Tryweryn? Well, to do so there is relatively cheap. Liverpool surveyors have discovered that there's a bed of rock in the valley, and so too a rich abundance of clay, which can be placed on top of the rock to stop the water from seeping away. There are large quarries nearby where large stones and boulders can be sourced to build the dam wall. Now, all this means that the transport costs of bringing this material in can be avoided. All the materials needed to build the reservoir are found in the valley. Furthermore, the area receives a lot of rainfall every year. So from Liverpool's point of view, the Tryweryn Valley is ideal. So the bill is now deposited in Parliament, and over the coming weeks and months, opposition against it being passed continues, notably in Wales, but so too is hostility to it expressed by some people in England. Nevertheless, the bill passes along its judicial journey, receiving support along the way. But the crucial vote, the second reading of the bill, occurred on the 3rd of July 1957. Following a passionate debate by members of Parliament who represent seats from across the United Kingdom, with some expressing their support for the bill and others voicing their opposition to it, the vote is finally taken. And by a majority, by 166 votes to 117, a majority of 49, not huge, the bill is passed. 3 weeks later, on the 31st of July 1957, the bill receives its third and final reading and is passed again. This time it has been agreed by those in support of the bill and those opposed to it not to debate the bill, but for it to pass in silence. The following night, Liverpool Corporation's Tryweryn Reservoir Bill received its royal assent and so became law. Now, importantly, not one of Wales's 36 MPs of whatever political colour votes in support of Liverpool's bill, and this opposition presumably reflects the opposition to the bill as held by the Welsh electorate, people in Wales who have voted for their MPs to represent them in Parliament. It is quite clear that despite all of Wales appearing to be united in opposing Liverpool's bill, and that this opposition by Welsh MPs has been expressed in the only seat of democracy available to Wales, Parliament, the interests of Wales and the stated wishes of the Welsh people have been ignored. Liverpool's bill has been passed in Liverpool's favour. And why? Because there are far more English MPs than there are Welsh MPs. And for one reason and another, many of them support Liverpool's proposal. It is clear to Welsh MPs that the interests of Wales are extremely vulnerable, both politically and culturally. If an authority in England decides to flood another valley in Wales to provide water for its residents, then there is nothing that Wales can do to prevent it. And so, with its bill passed in Parliament, Liverpool has the legal authority to build a reservoir in Cwm Tryweryn. And between 1960 and 1964, it does. The community who lives in the village of Capel Celyn and on the farms throughout the valley are moved out. Many receive compensation, which arguably is not sufficient, certainly in some cases. And the former inhabitants of Cwm Tryweryn are relocated, some nearby, while others move to live further away. But important factors of the Tryweryn story remain. On the 21st of October 1965, the reservoir, by now named Cwm Celyn, was officially opened by members of Liverpool City Council and other city dignitaries. Incredibly, Liverpool expects that the occasion will pass peacefully, and that the reservoir's official unveiling will demonstrate to the world Liverpool's prowess and proud municipal splendour, just as the opening of Llynfernwy had achieved some 75 years earlier. But the opening of Cwm Celyn is a very different event. Arriving Liverpool officials are greeted by a wall of protesters who attempt to prevent attendees from reaching the unveiling platform and also attack their cars, leaving many damaged and badly marked. The scheduled 45-minute ceremony is concluded in just 3 minutes, as demonstrators keep up a constant barrage of booing, jeers, and catcalls. A Union Jack flag, the flag of the United Kingdom, of course, is dragged through the mud, trampled on, and torn, and an attempt is made to set it alight. A volley of stones lands on the platform, with some of them hitting their mark. As the crowd maintains a steady stream of chants, some of them rude and ill-mannered, the Lord Mayor of Liverpool can be seen silently mouthing his appreciation at the creation of the reservoir. Although the noise of the protest is partly to blame for the Lord Mayor's declaration being inaudible, there is also another reason why it can't be heard. His microphone lead has been cut. So why has Liverpool got this so wrong? What has changed? Well, Wales has changed. Much of the world has changed. By the end of the 1950s and certainly into the 1960s, the age of deference which epitomised British society had ended. People are no longer prepared to be blindly led. People are far more demanding of change and improvement. Through news received via radio and television, people in Wales are aware of the civil rights movement in the United States, and so too the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Rights for women, rights for the gay community, and so on are gathering momentum. The 1960s is the age of protest. Now in Wales, 3 groups have emerged from the anger and frustration caused by the flooding of Cwm Tryweryn. Cymdeithas i'r Iaith Gymraeg, or in English, the Welsh Language Society, which campaigns to ensure that in Wales, Welsh has the same legal status as English. Remarkable from our modern standpoint that this was not always the case. The Free Wales Army undertakes its campaign of propaganda. To this end, it engages the UK and international media with exaggerated stories and wild and outlandish claims. Unsurprisingly, opinion remains divided as to the group's effectiveness and usefulness in promoting Welsh nationalism and Welsh patriotism across the world. And there is the far more secretive, audacious and militant Mudiad Amddiffyn Cymru, or in English, the Movement to Defend Wales, which undertakes a bombing campaign when over 20 sites in Wales and just over the border in England are attacked with explosives. For instance, tax offices are targeted and also pipelines carrying water from reservoirs in Wales to English cities. But do these campaigns make a difference? Do they lead to change? Well, in 1962, there was a huge investment in steel production at Llanwern. In 1964, the position of Secretary of State for Wales was created with its seat in the UK government and its main administrative office in Cardiff. In 1965, the DVLA, the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, moved to Swansea. In 1967, the Welsh Language Act was passed, and in 1968, the Royal Mint moved to Llantrisant. Importantly, some of these offices are significant symbols of state. So were these developments meant to send a message to the Welsh people that Wales rightfully belongs in the family of British nations? Or more cynically, perhaps, were these decisions taken to counter the rise in Welsh national consciousness and, even more, to undermine the growth of political Welsh nationalism? And in furtherance of this point, it should be noted that Gwynfor Evans, the president of Plaid Cymru, was victorious at the Carmarthen by-election in July 1966. so becoming the party's first Member of Parliament. Importantly, Mr. Evans' election victory occurred just 9 months after the opening of Cwm Celyn, and Gwynfor Evans winning the Carmarthen seat and the protests which marked the opening of Cwm Celyn are considered by some observers, notably Evans' successor as Plaid Cymru President, David Wyn, as events which were not unrelated. Whatever the truth regarding these considered advances, it does beg the question as to whether these decisions to create such employment facilities and the transfer of the aforementioned organisational offices to Wales would have taken place had it not been for the protests caused by the flooding of Cwm Tryweryn. I will certainly not endorse or voice my support for a bombing campaign. My second book addresses the militant protest undertaken by Mudiad Amddiffyn Cymru, and as much as I came to love and admire John Jenkins, the group's leader, whom I interviewed over a period of some 15 years, the appalling deaths of 2 men and the horrible and serious injuries suffered by a 10-year-old boy, not to mention the misery of others caught up in the protest, left me in no doubt that militancy is not the answer. So, before we conclude this presentation, let's just return and consider the remaining images. So there we are. The community goes to Liverpool, nothing happens. Their protests are basically ignored, and it's then put in front of Parliament. Now, this gentleman is Sir Lord Henry Brooke, and he had 2 offices in the UK cabinet. He's basically Minister for Welsh Affairs, so he's there to promote the political interests of Wales, you might say, but he's also Minister for Housing and Local Government. And if there is a conflict of interest, he does come down. It seems, I think it's fair to say, he wears his hat as Minister for Housing and Local Government a little more comfortably as he comes down in support of the bill to flood Cwm Tryweryn. He does state in Parliament during the debate that I mentioned, which occurred regarding the second reading of the bill on the 3rd of July, he does express the amount of correspondence he has received. 200 odd letters and 300 odd letters, I think, is the final figure. But nonetheless, it's quite clear from what his support of the bill that he believes that Liverpool has a duty to undertake this reservoir construction, leaving many people to feel, well, this is the only representation we've got in Parliament, and even the very person who's been appointed to defend our political interests is voting in opposition to them. This is the literature coming out in the early summer of 1957, so just before the bill is passed. So this is Tina Bont, name of the farm, which is flooded, and the little lad on the tricycle is Aaron Pryce-Jones, and that's his younger sister, Ergain Pryce-Jones. Now, even Aaron and Ergain had conflicting sort of remembrances, if you like, and recall different events when they went to Liverpool on the 21st of November 1956. With Aaron saying, well, I don't remember anything like that. People were indifferent, ambivalent to us being there. Ergain, on the other hand, said that she recalls, and she's 4 years old at this time, people being angry, rotten tomatoes, bad language, and all the rest of it. But another point worth mentioning is the abundance of flowers and fauna in the valley floor there. Now, that is in the pretty much the bed of the valley, a summer's day, obviously, but nonetheless, we see the amount of flowers would suggest that this is rich agricultural land. Steve Binns, interestingly, actually, the Liverpool historian that I spoke with, I asked him what the response from Liverpool or the people in Liverpool would have been. And he said, well, Liverpool has such a tradition of protest and campaigning and fighting for community rights and so on. There's some fair degree of chance that most people would have actually admired the fact that this community has gone there to protest for what they hold, dear to their lives and so on. So he said, again, it's interesting. You have anger and opposition being voiced by one person, indifference from somebody else, admiration from a third. So this is, again, the delights of research, if you like. Again, part of the literature coming out from those opposed to the flooding. We have their Caivadog, the farm I mentioned, the home of David Roberts. It says there that he's the vice president. Actually, that's wrong. He was the councillor. we see other farms, and then we see the community in Liverpool singing outside the city hall, begging really for the councillors to vote in their in support of not flooding the valley, which of course they don't. They vote in support of flooding the valley. And so the judicial process has ended, and now we see the construction, we see the clearance of the valley. This is the sale of farms and stock and so on. This was the first farm to do that. That was in October 1957. Some stayed much longer than that. Excuse me. But this is the first farm to sell its stock. There's a poignant tale in the research that I came across, which is correspondence, a letter in which the neighbour says that all her life she'd grown up to the sound of the cattle being brought in to milk in the morning. One day the shouts, the sound of the cattle. Next day silence, and it brought home to her exactly what was happening. Sale of the stock. Clearance of the houses, I should say. Ysgol Capel Celyn, which had educated a number of generations of the local community. One of my favorite shots of the whole research is that lady is Martha Jane Roberts, I should say. And I was told by her son that she hated the name Jane, so I had to get rid of all my Janes from the text. But that's Martha Roberts, who much loved, I have to say. I spoke to so many of the former pupils, not one, perhaps unsurprisingly, but nonetheless, the admiration for this lady and her efforts to educate the community, but also her sort of her awareness and her belief in the need for total education. So she's teaching them the need to speak Welsh to an academic level, you might say, intellectual level, but so too English. You need both Welsh and English to live in this world, in the world in which you're surrounded by. But also practical education about flowers and fauna, always to have money in your pocket at the time of telephone boxes being in the community, should it be required. So as I say, there wasn't one person, not perhaps I wasn't expecting there to be, but nonetheless, he was clearly held with a great deal of affection by those I spoke with who'd been taught by her. Now that is one farm, that is the Tynant family. How many there? So 8 there, with one more on the way. Again, part of the sort of the propaganda coming out of Liverpool that there was nothing worth staying for. Well, there we are. That's one family. Some, it's been suggested, would have left, of course, but others would have stayed. So there was a future, which is challenging this sort of idea coming out of Liverpool. Last day of shearing, that is July 1961, the community came together for the last time. It had supported one another for generations on shearing day over the course of a week. And that was the last day of shearing in July 1961, when the community came together. And there we see the construction of Llyn Celyn. Daniel Prysa-Jones, and that is the younger brother of Aaron and Ergain Prysa-Jones, who I mentioned a moment ago. Now I spoke to his sister Ergain about this, and we both chuckled at the photograph, because in this day of health and safety and all the rest of it, well, Daniel used to ride around without a care in the world on his tricycle, and she said it was just awful, the amount of noise, lorries. There was a circular route going around what is today the reservoir, because they wanted it to be a continual supply of rock and clay. And so Ysgol Capel Celyn was left open, remarkably really, until July 1963, when you might have expected it certainly would have closed a lot earlier today. But Daniel and others like him were taught in this atmosphere whereby there were lorries going by all day, every day, the sound of chainsaws, the smell of burning, because the construction people were burning the hedges because they didn't want anything to get into the mechanism of the dam. So hedges were burnt and stakes and so on. So there was a smell of smoke. wafting into the school very often. It was described to me as I'll come to in a moment with another shot, but the other guy basically said you'd have plumes of dust in the summer and it was like a quagmire in winter. And yet they were educated in this atmosphere. And she's quite certain that today they would have been counselling. That's their father. That's William Prister Jones. That's the caravan they went to live in while their new home was being built. The new home is just to my right, as it were, of that caravan, which now overlooks Cwm Celyn. The family lived in there for 18 months while their home was being built. The construction of Cwm Celyn and, well, the destruction of Capel Celyn, and there we see the lorries and so on. This would be around the autumn of 1963. Just waiting for the next shot. No, this is Mabel Evans, John and Mabel Evans, and they feature in the story because they were two who refused to join the protest. And the reason for that was the farm they lived in, which was on the higher reaches of the valley, was subject to forestation. Their best land was the higher, as I said, the lower parts of the valley were prone to marsh, prone to flooding, I should say, were marshy, and so they held their stock as other farmers did in the locale and the higher reaches of the valley. The name of the farm was Garneth Lloyd, and subject to forestation, which huge swathes of upland Wales was in the post-war era, because timber was needed in the building construction industry and so on, and for furniture and all the rest of it. And so they lost their land, their best land, so they couldn't keep sheep anymore. Now, this is happening in the early 1950s, 1950, 51. You then see the emergence of the Cwm Celyn story in 55, and they were approached to join the protest, and they said, well, you didn't help us then, why should we help you now? And so they refused to join the protests. They were given a new farm by Liverpool Corporation at what I think I can say was an attractive rate, and they could see the Cwm Celyn from their new farm, which is further down the valley towards Bala. And they could see the lights in the new road, for instance, even though it isn't that far at all, really. You're only talking a matter of like 6 miles or so, to give an idea of the emotional aspect of these situations and how people get so deeply sort of attached to their home. They said they never lost a sense of homesickness, even though it is only a short distance away. Tragically, there is a footnote. I'm afraid the Evanses were killed in a car crash in the early 1970s. So let's go to the next shot. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Now, that was taken in November 1963. And there's a Welsh barrister who's also a senior member of Plaid Cymru called Elfyn Lloyd. And Elfyn went with his sister and their father, who was a serving policeman at the time, and got out of their car in Rhongorch, which is just down the valley, and walked through, ignoring the advice on that placard, on that notice board. They were approached by workmen and in no uncertain terms told to leave. And Elfyn Lloyd's father, as I say, a serving policeman, said, we'll leave when we're ready to leave. They then walked back to the car, and their father turned to them. They were sat in the back, and with tears in his eyes, as Elfyn recounted it to me, said, listen, you two, whatever you do, wherever you go in life, do not forget this. And that's the impression it's having on a generation in Wales. There we see the destruction of the chapel. The last service was held in September 1963, very well attended. People came from miles around. A sad and poignant occasion, as you can imagine. There we see the burial ground. Arguably, I would say, in fact, without doubt, probably the most emotive aspect of the entire story. Some I spoke with, the archival records suggest that the bodies that were exhumed were done so carefully and with consideration. Others I spoke to said it wasn't anything like that. Basically, they were, as awful as this sounds, it was basically a case of being dug up by way of a JCB. Pretty much it was described to me as a licorice assortment. So people who believe that their descendants were exhumed and carefully placed elsewhere, it's actually been suggested that they might have the body of this, the body part of this person, and the bone of this person, and so on. So you can see again where why it is one reason alone for why this is such an emotive chapter in recent Welsh history. There we have it. That's prior, obviously, to before the water arrives. It was constructed in Celyn between August 1960 and August 1964, and it was described to me as a moonscape. And there we see the circular road that I mentioned. And there we see that is July 1964, and this is Liverpool Corporation, Liverpool City Council on their annual inspection, I should say, of their reservoir construction sites in Wales. So they would come to mid Wales and go to Llynfernwy, and this is obviously en route or on the way back from Llynfernwy, where they start to see progress at Llyn Celyn. The gentleman turning round pointing is the father of a gentleman who's well known in Great Britain called Sir Richard Stilgo. And it came as a great shock to me to discover that his father was Liverpool's water engineer, John Stilgo. There was some I spoke with who said that he had this sort of officious detachment, you could say, this sort of an arrogance. But Richard said, well, he did speak with an officer's voice, and that may have led to some sort of degree of misunderstanding. But I should say that others I spoke with said that Mr. Stilgo was an absolute gentleman, was never anything other than polite and courteous, and although he did have a job to do, his brief was to find a reservoir or a suitable reservoir site, which he did. Nonetheless, he did learn a degree of Welsh as a demonstration of respect for those whose lives were being affected, and also for reasons of easier communication. So again, the fog of history, you might say. That is just below the dam, where the dam wall is today, and that's a photograph that I took. It's basically where the soil was taken. That's what that great mound is there to the left of the shot. Now that was taken by me, and its significance is because on that concrete block, 3 members of Mudiad and Diffyn Cymru placed an explosive device underneath an electrical transformer, which was providing electricity to the construction site. Now that occurred on the 10th of February 1963. It exploded at 3 in the morning. Nobody was injured, but there's obviously a suggestion that the night watchman may well have been. However, it was during the worst winter that Britain had experienced up till then, the worst one off the top of my head from 1789, 1890. And so it was blizzard conditions. They laid this device at 10 p.m., made their way back to the car. It exploded some 5 hours later. Emma Llewellyn-Jones was arrested the following weekend. There's some suggestion he deliberately left a handkerchief which was embossed with the letter E. Now, Emmy is known to authorities because of his commitment to the Welsh Language Society, Cymdeithas Iaith Cymraeg, who were holding a rally that same Saturday afternoon in Aberystwyth. And when it was pointed out that Emyr hadn't attended, somewhat to the surprise of those who did and the authorities, the reason he didn't attend, because that night he's planting a device along with 2 others, Owain Williams and John Albert Jones, on that concrete block. And then here we are, 21st of October 1965, and the opening of Llyn Celyn. We see students, predominantly students, but certainly not entirely made up of only students. People from across Wales were there, notably the university cities of Bangor, Aberystwyth and Cardiff and so on. People sitting on the road, as we see there, with placards, Liverpool steals Welsh water, and so on. The police, from what I gather, were restrained and good, well, I'd say good humoured about it, but sort of were restrained in their response, just dragging people out of the way in order to allow the cars to pass. But one of the things that struck me was the lady here to the left of the shot, who seems well dressed. She's holding a placard with Gwlad country, with pearls, hair done. So it isn't just sort of unruly students, you might say. We're coming to another favourite shot of Gwynfor Evans, I should say, before we get there. Now, that is the president of Plaid Cymru, Gwynfor Evans, who 9 months later wins the Carmarthen seat at the by-election, and so becomes Plaid Cymru's first MP. Now, he's appealing for calm there, although I quietly would suggest that Mr. Evans was quietly rather pleased to see the protest, would be my guess. And the lady in the middle of the shot there is a Welsh writer called Menna Kravos, who was a student in Aberystwyth, if I'm correct. And she said, I had to go there. I spoke to her. She features in the book, to do my bit. Determined. I sat in the road, but I was determined not to lose my handbag. So I'm clutching hold of my handbag as well at the same time, which we chuckled about. But she said it's interesting because these weren't sort of unruly students. She said we were middle class students, young people, really. Protest wasn't really part of our history, but we were so outraged at what was happening. It's been numbered in the book that various media accounts say there are 1,000. I think it's likely somewhere within the region of 500 within. I often joke that we occasionally have a hot summer in Wales, and that was one of them. That was 1989, and that is the wall of the chapel re-emerging. And we come to selection now of graffiti, which is invariably scrawled on the walls. I'll leave you to read that. And there we are, Llyn Celyn today. Now, the symbol there is the Free Wales Army, the FWA. It's the White Eagle of Snowdonia, which legend has states that it'll come back to defend Wales in its hour of need. So the Free Wales Army adopted that as its symbol in the 1960s. And 50 blwyddyn is 50 years. Cofio means remember. Llyn Celyn, photograph that I took on in my experience, is a typically grey and overcast day. I end the book with a description. I wanted to know what it was like at various times of the day. So I went to dawn in winter, dawn in summer, sunset in summer, sunset in winter, just to get a feel of the changing seasons and how quiet it is. And it's not a nice place to be, really. And there's always seems to be a chill, even on a summer's day. That is a summer's day, and we see the sun setting there in the western sky. Cofiwch Tryweryn. Now that sign, some of you may know, it's that slogan was painted in around about 1965, and it's been there ever since. It now has some sort of legal guardian status. Cofiwch Tryweryn, remember Tryweryn. It's been defaced. It has to say, I should say, a number of times, which has resulted in it being repainted and strengthened. The wall was fallen away, and it's now part of the Welsh landscape, really. It's probably has more of a sort of a visceral sort of appeal to people than even the reservoir itself does. It's just south, for those who don't know, it's just south of Aberystwyth in a village called Llanrhysted. I'll end on that shot. And so let's conclude the presentation. But what of the longer picture? Well, it's been suggested that the Cwm Tryweryn community was not as united in opposing the creation of the reservoir as the legend maintained. Furthermore, as it transpired, the amount of water that Liverpool claimed it would require an extra 65 million gallons of water every day was not needed. Not only does Liverpool experience a decline in its population, but the much heralded boom in heavy industry on Merseyside fails to occur. Well, what have been the political and cultural repercussions to Wales since Cwm Tryweryn was controversially flooded some 60 years ago? Well, in September 1997, Wales voted in support of a Welsh Assembly and some measure of devolved government. It has been argued that the drowning of the Tryweryn Valley and the construction of Cwm Celyn were a contributing and influential factor in Wales's decision to vote for devolution. Many voters believing that Wales needed more control over its political affairs. And what about the picture from a cultural point of view? Well, the flooding of Cwm Tryweryn has inspired musicians, songwriters, poets, artists, paintings, and sculptors. It is clear then that despite the resentment and exasperation of Tryweryn, Wales emerged stronger, both politically and culturally, and perhaps consequently more confident than ever before. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that while the sun may have set on a period of Welsh history when Cwm Tryweryn was submerged, so too did Tryweryn hail for Wales a new beginning, and for our proud old nation, a new dawn. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Robert.
Well, diolch yn fawr, Wyn. So I do see a couple of questions here, and you can probably may see them too. Bob S., thank you, Wyn, for your interesting presentation. Coming to the present day and in the context of historical resource exploitation of the Welsh landscape driven by those outside of Wales for the greater good, how significant do you view the current plans to be for the widespread expansion of large-scale renewable energy generation and transmission across Wales?
I think it's a very good question. It's certainly, a salient point, because there is this sort of debate going on in Wales at the moment of feeding 100-foot pylons from my region of Mid Wales down through the Towey Valley, which is renowned around the world for its beauty. It's been argued that these don't need to be supplied by way of 100-foot pylons, but can be placed underground. So that is a discussion ongoing at the moment. It's certainly one I favour. A cause of added controversy, although it's not raising its head too much at the moment, is the fact that this isn't actually required in Wales anyway. It's been fed it's been provided to provide electricity for the England Midlands. So that's adding to this argument of the Welsh landscape being destroyed for the needs of England, if you like. But I'm trying to steer the argument away from this being a Wales versus England thing and saying, okay, for the greater good, I certainly buy into that idea. If this electricity is needed, then we need to provide it. But I don't see how the destruction of the Welsh landscape, should be a part of that. So let's put these underground. Not ideal. I'm not saying for one moment it's the lesser of two evils, but it seems to be the better option. But I also agree with the idea that let's look at renewable energy, look at wind resources and so on, look at offshore resources. It seems, let's go away from fossil fuels. I agree with that argument. Clean energy, of course, is the future. But let's do this in a way, let's not be considered sort of, Luddites in this and hostile to the idea of progress. I mean, it doesn't help anybody. We all need water, we all need electricity. But the supply of which I think needs to be undertaken, as I say in the book, with dignity and sensitivity, and the best outcome reached for all. So it seems as if whether or not this is the moment, I think perhaps it's even been argued that this is the moment of the Senedd comes into its own, really. People suffered to see the Senedd emerge. People sacrificed a lot. These are our elected representatives. Well, let's see this in action then. At the moment, they're being a bit quiet about it, I think, because they're not allowing it to be a public debate. So there is some suggestion that they may be actually in support of this policy. I'm not sure, really. What I'm understanding is that there's a growing hostility to it, certainly in Mid Wales. And what I'm trying to say, I was approached by the Pylons opposition group, and I did make a video which is on YouTube, So if our viewers would like to look at that at a later date, I mean, it's there, and I state why this could be our Tryweryn. It's not just this affects the geography of Wales in the same way that the flooding of Cwm Tryweryn did. It wasn't just about Meirionnydd. So when you see the destruction of something which is so beautiful, and you sort of think, well, okay, how do we go about this in the right way? They don't seem to be quite sort of buying into the idea of offshore, which I think people are saying, well, why not see that as a way forward then?
Well,
it's a very good question. It's a very, as I say, a salient point, because it's how we go forward and how this taps into the idea of the Senedd, and whether it's now accurately reflects the feelings of Wales, we shall soon see, I think.
Well, thank you, Wyn. And apologies if I was butting in there a moment. I wasn't quite sure that you were done. So yes, and actually, we have exactly the same issues right here in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin countryside with those sort of power lines and large pylons, and those have been issues. So I think it's and I think other places pretty much anywhere in the world, there are these sort of issues that come up. And so I think lots of people could relate to that. Somebody asks, Glennis asks, do we know how much compensation the displaced people received?
Yeah, again, a very good question. It's part of the lingering animosity, I think, of the entire Tryweryn saga, is how little really those affected were compensated. And the entire reservoir construction program came to £19.5 million. At the time, I chucked that through a changer, and it came out to 435 million today. So not an insignificant amount of money, but nonetheless, judging by the cost and the fact that this costs were kept down so much because the raw materials were there, it could have cost an awful lot more. And I think what they should have done was more adequately compensate those being affected. If I could refer you to the book, all of them I've translated and transcribed from the original figures to the figures of 2022. And on first inspection, it might not seem too bad. However, when you take in startup costs and all the rest of it, they were a pittance, really. So even those who you might say weren't particularly badly, recompensed, you will have to, by weighing up the cost and what is being lost. A lot of them just went out of business. And a lot of, like David Roberts, for instance, would have received enough money to buy another house, but he had to buy a house in urban Bala. Well, he didn't want to live in urban Bala. He wanted to live on his farm in, Cwm Celyn and further the family tradition. So he ends up living in a house in Bala on a street, and the poor man passes away within 18 months. So it isn't just, it's the financial cost, which is poor anyway, but there's a huge emotional cost as well. But I will say, as I said, part of the lingering animosity really is because of the compensation. They were quite measly about it, really. And I think they saw it all as part of the cost-cutting exercise. Somewhat in their defense, this is post-war Britain. There isn't a lot of money about. And, emotional reactions wouldn't have figured too strongly at all. Cultural sensibilities wouldn't have featured too strongly in the eyes of the Liverpool County Council. They just want another reservoir. We'll do this as cheaply as we can. And any national sensibilities as expressed by the people in Wales, not to mention those who live there, we don't actually care too much about, really. There is some sort of effort to say, well, if Welsh culture can't survive this, then it isn't worth saving anyway. But I think part of the problem is that why there isn't the response that there was at Ifanner. For instance, if we look at the opening of Llynfernwy, so 70 years earlier, and you see Ifanner, the Welsh paper called The Flag. Now they speak quite remarkably from a modern standpoint, really, but you're reading accounts where they're saying that Llynfernwy is Wales' proud contribution to the empire. Amazing when you think of what happened 70 years later. Well, of course, the Western world has changed. You see the emergence of people standing up for their community, for their language, for their cultural expression. But also because at Llynfernwy's creation, there isn't this depopulation issue, which Wales is suffering from by the time of Cwm Celyn. So people are leaving rural areas to live in Cardiff, particularly in Swansea and so on, and moving to England. So depopulation is a major problem in Wales at this time. And I think it symbolises all of that. It sees an end of, what many people in Wales hold dear, which is the language. Welsh-speaking communities, which are thriving, are now under attack. So it not only does it sort of exemplify that issue, but it exemplifies what is wrong really between the relationship between Wales and the United Kingdom, because Wales is extremely vulnerable to any policy being pushed through by English MPs who, for one reason and another, as I say, vote in support of Liverpool. Basically, because they're of the view that, well, this could be us in 5 years' time. We could be needing a reservoir. And there's also, I think there's probably also a need of national allegiances. So English MPs supporting other English MPs. But I was surprised by the vote. It wasn't it's not huge. It's only a majority of 49. So there was opposition to it expressed by English MPs, both in Parliament and in the media. We said, look, is this really needed? Are you sure you've done the sums here? And it's been argued that they didn't. They wanted a reservoir of their own to rival Manchester. They wanted to be the provider for the Northwest. And as I say, Liverpool, municipal splendor and prowess and all the rest of it. But this forecast, they're looking at 1975, they're looking at 1980, and these figures just don't materialize because there is also a decline in population on Merseyside. So, but in fairness to people like John Stilgo, he didn't know that at the time. Although it could have been forecasted, because people are saying, well, if we look at the 1956 figures, your domestic consumption needs are more than met by the water you're receiving from Llynfernwy. So why are you creating another reservoir which will provide you with another 65 million gallons of water? Well, they need it in order to sell to neighbouring authorities. And I think an interesting point is that there are clauses in the 1880 bill which are still alive. And so Liverpool still has a judicial obligation, if you like, to provide water for neighbouring authorities. So that is another part of the argument which sometimes is lost, I think.
When we have a couple more questions, and I want to ask you a question right now, which I've been wondering about is, what about the infrastructure to actually get the water to Liverpool? What did that entail, and were there any issues that came up with that?
It's a very good question, because it basically, part of Liverpool's reasoning for this was that it was only fed from Llyn Celyn to the River Dee, and then it's transferred, so it's supplying water to the River Dee, which then goes into Liverpool by various means. So yes, it's seen as really that the water treatment plant, for instance, is over the border in England. So they're trying to say, well, this isn't Welsh water. It's treated by us here in England. So they're making all these measly sort of arguments, you might say, to make it about this being English water all of a sudden. And it gets a little bit farcical, really, where it falls from the heaven. The argument is it would have just washed to the sea anyway. So we're creating a reservoir for the needs, for the greater good, which arguably is true. But it meets the pipeline from Llynfernwy, and then it's sort of fed to Liverpool. So they try to keep the cost down again. So the infrastructure is really, it's not about piping it for any particular length of time or where it becomes expensive, because that in itself is expensive. So it's about feeding the River Dee, really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sue says, my great-grandfather immigrated from South Wales to the US in the 1870s. His homestead farm in northeast Washington state was flooded for the equalizing reservoir for Grand Coulee Dam in the mid-1930s. And the farm's two-story, six-bedroom house was moved about 15 miles into a nearby town. Something you can do with an American house, but you can't really do with a stone cottage in Wales, obviously, where my grandparents lived until their deaths. The upstream impoundment behind Grand Coulee Dam, now Lake Roosevelt, reaches to the Canadian border, and several small communities were moved or abandoned during the reservoir construction. So I think that speaks to the universality of these experiences. As in the modern world, as we deal with energy and and water supply and all of these things. these needs of our civilization. This is a common experience across developed and developing countries.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, something I made a point of including in the book, Robert. Actually, let's keep this in perspective. It's important to Wales because I think it focused the minds. It made us, and rightly so. I can see why people realised why we were vulnerable politically and culturally. But I also make a point of saying, look, let's keep this in perspective. There's been no end of communities which have been moved and, for want of a better word, destroyed because of reservoir construction programs. So it's about recognizing, while it's important to Wales, and I can see why it is a universal story. And so it's about putting it in its rightful place as well. And really, the reason why I chose the title of New Dawn is saying that, some good came, in fact, a lot of good came out of it. It made artistic expression in Wales was certainly benefited from it. And arguably it led to the Senate, with people saying we need more control over our political affairs. It can't just be about putting our affairs in the hands of Parliament. So, and I'm sorry to hear Susan's story there, because obviously it would have affected her grandparents, and I hope not to the detrimental effect it appears to have affected some people here over Cwm Tryweryn.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of coming to the end here, unless anybody else has any additional questions. I do see a comment from Aeolus, who I know quite well, Aeolus Barker. She says, "Diolch Wyn o arall o blant Bethel Aberystwyth. Aeolus Groesgoed." um, that's nice to have a greeting. You talked about the Cofiwch Tryweryn, the mural,
Yeah,
which I've seen a couple of times south of Aberystwyth, and it's something that here actually in the States, I painted one on the side of our a small one on the side of our museum in Nebraska. There's one quite large one painted on a wall in Rio Grande, Ohio, which is where there was a substantial Welsh community, and now there is the Madog Center for Welsh Studies at the local college there. I know of one in Chicago, at least one or two in Chicago that have been painted there. So the fame of that mural has spread. I'd like to add too that when I painted it's actually because we had the NAFO, the North American Festival of Wales in Lincoln, back last year. And so in the summer, I thought it might be fun to paint one of those murals, and because we would have people visiting from Wales, and there was sort of there was actually sort of I don't want to say a fad, but it was last summer and over recent years, people have been painting a lot of those murals around Wales.
yes,
And I thought it would be fun to do that at our centre. And one of the interesting things was that I was approached by a couple of news organisations in Wales, and interviewed, and this popped up on Nation.Cymru and the BBC and Wales Online. And I was looking at people's comments, and some people thought, well, this is very hypocritical for Welsh people who came to America, living on living on land that was taken from Native Americans, and to be putting this here, and I actually responded to that and said, actually, you're making a very good point,
yeah,
and I think that we should have these discussions about, uh, you know. Uh, we sometimes we might frame this within the context of colonization,
mm,
but the people who came to North America from Wales and settled on land. They settled on land that they may not be the ones who actually did the removal themselves, but they benefited from the removal of other people, and that's something that I think we're all conscious of, and
yes,
so we can learn from this. I would like to say one of the things I really appreciate about your work, Wyn, is how you really look at all sides of this, and you look at what the people of Liverpool were experiencing, and you look at it from their perspective, And you also look, as well as looking at it from the perspective of the people who lost their homes at Capel Celyn. And I think that's a very valuable and really the appropriate way to look at a historical controversy like this.
Oh, thank you, Robert. I appreciate that. It felt really the only way to do it. I have to say there wasn't much sort of inner discussion. I felt that this had to be undertaken with that degree of impartiality, really. And even John Jenkins' book, the second book, it's about saying, okay, I can understand your feelings, John, but there were repercussions to your bombing campaign, and we need to look at those repercussions. They're a very important part of the story, of course. And thank you, Robert. I think any sort of history that I enjoy reading or watching, you have to be presented with both sides of the story, really. Otherwise, it's just propaganda, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. Well, I just have if you have any, do you have any other closing remarks, or otherwise I will bring things to a conclusion.
Well, I need to say thank you very much. It's a lovely way to spend a Sunday evening. Actually, I hadn't got much planned. You said I know it's Sunday, but diolch yn fawr. So thank you very much indeed. But lovely. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, and I'd like to come back. And if you'd like to look at my website, it's www.drwynthomas.com, and there's a lot of the information. Diolch. So yes, I mean it's work I've thoroughly enjoyed. It's taken me 20 plus years to get the research and write it all up, but I hope it offers something of an important, albeit a very small, but hopefully an important contribution to our nation's historiography. And I see myself as a bit of a global citizen anyway, Robert. I love my backpacking years of 20 months, 22 months traveling, and we're all part of the wider family, which is part of my message as well.
Yeah, well, you will certainly enjoy it.
Thank you, Judith. You just got off screen.
.org.
Hello, I'm still here. I'm
Hello?
Hello, Robert. Hi. I've lost your picture, but you're just coming through now.
Okay, good. So yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with Zoom today, but it's been a little I've had a few little hiccups here. Um, so you can learn more about the Great Plains Welsh Heritage Centre at greatplainswelsh.org. For those of you who don't know, we are in the process of actually planning and building an extension to our facility in Wymore, Nebraska, where we want to bring more items from our archive out for public display and make our museum bigger and better. So you are welcome. We would encourage you to visit our website, greatplainswelsh.org, to take a look at those plans. If you would like to become a member, we have a full color newsletter that we send out both digitally and in print, if you would prefer. We also welcome, in addition to memberships and donations to our expansion, we welcome donations to our operations fund. That's also crucial as well. So please go to greatplainswelsh.org to learn more about what we do. And I want to again thank Dr. Wyn Thomas for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to hear him, and we will be back in the new year with some more of these seminars and talks. So stay tuned. It'll be on our website and on Facebook, information about those. So diolch yn fawr iawn i chi i gyd am ymuno â ni heddiw.
Diolch yn fawr, Robert. Lovely to meet you all.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Nos da.
Nos da.